mostly the conversation on democracy and governance, developmental issues, the bulk of the responsibility, well, is on the government. But also in a democracy, the opposition is not excluded. It would be quite interesting to hear your perspective on what the role of other opposition parties are in development in governance and democracy generally.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I actually have the fortune of having studied political science for my undergraduate, and so I know what the theoretical response to this question is. An opposition is first of all supposed to offer alternative ideas. You have to think about governance as a contestation of ideas, a different set of philosophies on how we govern. So whether you're coming from traditionally in political science, you have maybe you come from the left or from the right, whether you're coming from a liberal sense, progressive sense, or from a conservative sense, which says we need to keep the status quo as is, but just overall, different political parties are supposed to offer a frame by which we're supposed to see governance. So first will be at the top level, what's your idea of governance? What are the major policies you are championing that you bring forth? In this case, His Excellency the President was very clear. He has a big 5 governing agenda. He understands that he's a human capital development president. This is an idea, philosophy by which he governs. And this is also, as you know, was the basis of his coming to power. The second and very important part of the role of an opposition in a democracy as well is to hold us in governance to account. They should provide a set of checks and balances to government. So say, you've done this, provide a critical analysis of the work that we're doing and say, this is where you went right, this is where you went wrong, making sure that we are kept on our toes. This is important. Democracy does not thrive if you have just one way, all man they go the same way. Democracy requires, this is why when people say, we're divided, I say no. It is a good thing that we are not on the same side. I have very good friends on the opposition side. It is a good thing. Without that, you don't have a democracy. If we all been there one side, not a democracy it is. So you are required to provide. Again, without being disagreeable, you can disagree. The Honorable Agokabo said it very eloquently in Parliament when President Spio spoke and we did the press conference. He said, just because we're in opposition does not mean we are opposed to the country's development, and people conflate those two things. Another thing an opposition is supposed to do is to present and offer diverse voices in the governance process. The opposition is supposed to work with the diversity of views and voices to make sure that the governance process reflects all these voices across governance. And then and the other thing, final thing I would say is the opposition is also supposed to offer not just a critique, but an alternative vision. If na been we, na so, we for do know. That vision is also important in a governance and a democracy, because even as we govern, and we say in human capital development, we're centering the ordinary person and all that, the opposition is supposed to keep reminding the populace that this alternative vision exists, and this is how that alternative should manifest. So those would be, I think, from a political science perspective, those would be the 4 big buckets of what an opposition is supposed to do.
Jesmed Suma is the chairman and leader of the National Grand Coalition, NGC party. The minister has spoken about what the opposition or opposition parties should be, their role in governance and democracy. Luckily, you had just walked in when he started making his submission. But also, as he painted that picture, there is a role of the ruling government, the party in power in the seat of presidency, for other opposition parties to be able to live up, perhaps, for lack of a better way to put it, to their functions in society. Has the ruling government been giving opposition parties that space to able to contribute towards governance and democracy as freely as they ought to?
Thank you for having me, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings to you, my friend Minister. Opposition supposed to see themselves as government in waiting. It should be structured as government in waiting. As the minister rightly said, you can be critical but not necessarily opposed to or against development. So if the opposition sees itself as one that is government in waiting, then the opposition should be ready and prepared with its own set of policies that will serve as alternative to what the government is offering. With regards to the sustenance of democratic activities, which is part of the role of opposition parties, it is the government responsibility as constitutionally demanded to ensure that democracy strive within the country, because without which we will resort to a dictatorship where nobody is having the right to criticize. Now, unfortunately here in Sierra Leone, we have two dominant political parties. As we all know, they're always at loggerheads, but they seem to agree on one thing: to stifle the political space and limit it only to those two political parties. As you have seen over the several months, when this issue about the tripartite was brought up and encouraged by the international community, our party was and still is in support of the actions of the tripartite committee. They were initially focused on peace between APC and SLPP, but their mandate was extended to review and make recommendations as regards to what changes needs to be done within our electoral systems to make sure that the democratic process is fair and balanced. Unfortunately, the rest of us were excluded. Initially, I should say, but I think still excluded, because in the sense that even though our party made several efforts, wrote letters, approached the Peace Commission, and contacted the international community, they eventually gave us an opening for us to put forward our own set of recommendations. Unfortunately, of all the 80 recommendations submitted by the tripartite committee, I could hardly see anything that we submitted as our own alternative. So that's just an example of why I think much is not being encouraged in terms of encouraging multi-party systems outside the two existing political parties. For instance, this so-called PR system, which is supposed to create an opportunity for smaller parties to have a say in governance, in Sierra Leone is used to stifle smaller parties into extinction. As reflected in the results of the 2023 elections, all other parties that had seats in parliament have disappeared. Their seats have disappeared because the threshold that is established, completely different from global standard.
Okay.
In places like Italy and Israel and other parts of the world that does the PR system, their threshold is less than 5%. Ours is 11.9%. And we're talking about struggling political parties competing against giants that have existed over 30, 40 or more years for resources to engage in electoral activities in the millions of dollars. They can afford $2, $3, $4, $5 million. We can hardly afford $1 million to compete with them. And then they put the threshold such a way that it's not attainable. So we are strongly opposed to the PR system as it is.
Jesmed, those could be spices to spice up, the meal that we're about to prepare. But again, how constructive are opposition parties in Sierra Leone?
Well, the reality is they're not constructive. With the exception of the NGC party, we're trying now to restructure it to be constructive. And the reason being is because we have we have one-man show, briefcase political parties existing in the country. And you will begin to wonder, how do they continue to exist? Because a political party is supposed to have a following, it's supposed to have numbers, it's supposed to have people that follow them. And if you have political parties that exist in briefcase, there must be a reason. It's because the two big giant political parties are using these smaller political parties.
Including the NGC?
Yeah, stuff a lie. I say that because NGC is excluded. Blatantly. I'm pointing it out because I know what the problem is. I cannot see a problem and put myself into it. So these smaller parties are being used as a tool by APC and SLPP. You have APA.
Including the NGC.
Including the NGC.
No, NGC is not included in that.
But how,
So
how do you say that when the just concluded elections of last year, the NGC had entered into an agreement with the ruling party, the SLPP? You came up with an agreement. You did not put forward a presidential candidate because you threw your support to the SLPP. So how conveniently do you exclude the NGC from being part of the problem?
Well, that's a very good point, but guess what? We went there in good faith. We relied and depend on the faith and trust we had in our former leader.
So the agreement you had is not the subject of the conversation. It's just
No,
to
it's
point out that the NGC itself is a part of the problem, as you earlier submitted about the
part of the problem.
about the other political parties.
Was part of the problem. I agree and concede to that. But the good thing with the NGC party is now led and held by independent-minded individuals,
okay,
who most of us have never been part of SLPP, nor have we been part of APC.
okay.
That is the uniqueness of the NGC party as a rebut to the new dispensation.